of Professor Smith. My distinguished panelist today is Mr. Majekodunmi, a very difficult name to pronounce. So the best is to cut it into parts and say Majekodunmi, who comes from Nigeria originally and is half Nigerian, half British, has worked in the High Commissioner's Office for Human Rights for 20 years, has served everywhere, in Rwanda, in Nepal, in Gaza, in Haiti, in Geneva, in New York. So is the ranking expert on the subject in the United Nations system. Most people in the United Nations seem to believe that human rights was discovered by the United Nations in 1948 in what is called the Universal Declaration. And like many other things in the United Nations, nothing could be further from the truth. The concept of human rights has nothing to do with the United Nations. It is part of the fundamental teachings of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and everything else. So human rights were discovered more than 10,000 years ago and have been understood and respected for 10,000 years, and disrespected also. But Western civilization, which is a very poor quality civilization compared to African or Asian or Latin American civilizations, because it's a late arrival on the scene. European civilization does not exist before 1,000 years from today. You cannot tell me anything about Europe other than the Romans and the Greeks. But the rest of Europe was a swamp with bad weather. And these were swamp people, the people of the bogs. And then 1,000 years ago, it comes with the first milestone in human rights, which is Magna Carta, in which a bunch of noblemen get together and say to the king, Mr. King, in future you must consult us. And the king was very wise. He says, okay. He signed the paper. And the noblemen went home thinking they had scored a victory. And the king took the paper, put it in his desk, and forgot all about it. And so it was never implemented. And so the second milestone comes 400 years later, in 1675. And that is the Act of Habeas Corpus, in which, for the first time, they say, Mr. King, you cannot put somebody in a dungeon without producing him in front of a third party to explain why you are doing that. And that third party is called a court. And this is the principle of no detention without trial. And it was a very important principle because it spread around the world and is now a part of all legal systems. So it's an important milestone. Then you get the extraordinary experiences of the 18th and 19th and 20th century, in which you have colonialism first, along with slavery, complete denial of human rights. Then you have two revolutions in America and in France, which talk about human rights, but do not implement them, because in the United States, slavery continues, and in France, colonialism continues for 200 years. And then finally you get the worst case hypothesis, which is Nazism, in which a country decides to eliminate a whole group of people, by killing them, by roasting them in ovens. And so the United Nations then stands up and says, we are going to have the next milestone, which is the Declaration of 1948. And it's no doubt that it's an important milestone. But you must understand that there are several problems with that milestone. Would you like to deal with them, or shall I?
Please go ahead.
Let me go ahead. The first problem is that this universal, so-called Universal Declaration is not universal at all. There were 48 countries which were negotiating, and that's it. The others just signed on. But the actual negotiation was 48 countries. I was not there. I do not accept any document that I have not negotiated myself. And out of 193 countries, the vast majority were not there. And so the declaration has a high-sounding name, but it is not universal. You have to examine it for its content. And its content is deficient because it talks basically about political rights. And it just so happens that for 75% of the world, for us, economic rights are as important, if not more important, than political rights. And so right from 1948, we said there is a missing economic component. And it took 28 years for the three-quarters of the world, 75% of the world, it took them 28 years to convince the small minority that the document was inadequate. And so it is in 1976 that you get two additional documents, the Convention on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on Economic and Social Rights, ratified and in force in 1976. And the worry and the tragedy is that while one document, the political document, is widely signed and ratified, the economic document is not widely signed and ratified. And it is shameful that a most decent country, whom we love and admire for its leadership and its example, which we don't name because of the soil on which we stand, has not ratified the second convention until today. And it is shameful. And so the concept of the right to development and economic rights is a very important concept. We had a huge global conference in 1993 in Vienna, where this was discussed threadbare. And there was a disagreement. And you know that in the United Nations, disagreements, normally there are one or two lead ambassadors who lead the disagreement. And so on one side you had the ambassador of the United States, and on the other side you had a puny ambassador, Kamal, of Pakistan. And the debate was, does the right of development exist, yes or no? And the American ambassador said no. And the Pakistan ambassador said yes. And we had to take it to a vote. I got 120 votes in my favor. And the US ambassador got 4 votes in his favor. The vote was 128 to 4. And which were the other 3 countries with him? somebody called Marshall Islands, somebody called Palau, somebody called, I don't know, Vanuatu. I don't even know where those countries are. And so, human rights is a fundamental problem. So, I hope you heard my litany of shame in human rights, because it is truly sad. If you believe in human rights, you must, and if you believe in democracy, which I hope you do, then you must respect the views of 75% of the population of the world. You cannot talk down to 75%. You have to listen, respect, acknowledge, and obey. That is democracy. So I'm afraid we have major problems in human rights. This is one of them. But the question is, Mr. Majekodunmi, what is your view on all this? You are a ranking person in the High Commission for Human Rights. You are defending the United Nations system. I'm not. I'm an outside observer. So I can afford to have an independent opinion. What are your views? Do you see any merit in what I'm saying? And if so, what are you doing about it?
Thank you very much, Ahmad Kamal. Good to be in front of the students. I think, first of all, I'd be setting myself up for failure if I accepted the term ranking human rights official within the UN. I'll just stand back from that slightly. And I think also I challenge the posturing of me as defending the UN. I think ideally I'd describe myself, I would aspire to be a human rights defender working through the UN system. The UN has many faults, and I think part of strengthening the UN is recognizing those faults. Nevertheless, I think the system is a flawed system. The UN human rights system, the international human rights system, is a flawed system, but it's a good system. It's one that I certainly believe in. It's one that's influenced my personal life, professional choices. I've spent the last 20 years, since dishwashing in the south of France to moving on to the UN. I could have chosen to do other things, and I've stayed here both with the UN human rights system and then within the UN. I could have chosen a human rights approach that was through, for example, civil society, through Human Rights Watch or others potentially, but I chose to do this within the UN. My sense is that it's, when I have doubts, for example, doubts such as those proposed by the ambassador, I try to start at the end of the scenario. So say, for example, we are in Mali, in northern Kenya. There are people, internally displaced people, refugees, who will walk for days, carrying 5 children, and then leaving 2 who've died, and carrying those who survive, to reach a certain point, because they've heard that the UN is present at that point, and because they have a sense that the UN is coming with a human rights approach. I think for me that's a very good place to start in terms of what is the qualitative value of what we have in terms of human rights. I think that we've collectively, the world has created a perception of the inherent value of human beings, that when you're looking at yourself, when you're thinking, I'm in trouble, I need help, one has a sense that I have this value, I have a right, even in places, in contexts where those rights are completely crushed. The people who are being crushed, even as they're being crushed, they're thinking this is an injustice, and it's injustice because they have rights, because they have a sense that those rights exist and they're not being respected. If the rights didn't exist, then where's the injustice? I'm just being crushed because I was born to be crushed at some point. That's a pretty low threshold in terms of, is the international human rights system a good one? But it's an important one. I think it's an absolutely incredible thing. with all the flaws of the UN, if we were to take the UN as an example of perhaps a physical embodiment of human rights at a certain moment, all UN staff travel with a blue passport, UN Blue, and you can arrive at a potentially unfriendly airport in a potentially unfriendly situation, and you can be admitted, and nobody really worries what language you speak, the color of your skin, your gender, your age, your nationality, because there's a sense, okay, well, UN, we have them in a box, and they're relatively harmless in terms of the politics of this situation. So it's rather a general answer that I'm giving you, Ambassador. But when I get a little bit lost, or a little bit uncertain as to whether or not this is all worthwhile, I try to go to the end, go to the very worst situations. And I think that this is actually an incredible concept that has been created, all of its flaws, myriad may they be, whether in terms of the law, which is a work in progress, whether in terms of the various processes, judicial, political, domestic, governmental, intergovernmental, through which we try to apply the law, very flawed, but process that marks progress. In the last few years, we've seen international human rights law leaping forward, for example, with greater protections for persons with disabilities. We've seen increasing willingness to abolish the death penalty, to pass an international human rights instrument that would go against the death penalty, which I personally think would be a good move. The law is something in progress, and I think it's moving in the right direction. We very, very rarely see steps backward.
Yes, but Mr. Majekodunmi, I'm not interested in your blue passport. I'm interested only in the major problems that we have. The major problem is that there are people dying of hunger and disease in the world. And my question was, what are you doing about it? And all that you said is, I'm traveling with a blue passport. I'm sorry, that does not answer my question. Poverty is the greatest violation of human rights. And the entire UN system is concentrating on disabled people and wheelchairs and blue passports, which are very important, no doubt. But they are not as important as the fact that 30 or 50 million people are dying every year, out of poverty and disease. 30 to 50 million. What are you doing about that? You don't even seem to be worried about this, the gap between the rich and the poor. That gap is huge and it is doubling. And then I have other problems that I want to bring up. And let me list them straight away, and then you can try to answer them, and then we must open to questions from our guests. There is a major problem between universality of norms and diversity of cultures. That there are some norms which have been drafted by you in this famous Universal Declaration, and they are not accepted by other cultures in the rest of the world. And so the question is, which of those norms will prevail? Do the norms drafted by Eleanor Roosevelt in Paris in 1948, are they valid, or is a cultural pattern which has existed in some country in Africa for 10,000 years? Which of the two has greater validity in terms of human beings? And we can discuss examples of where this particular clash takes place between universality and diversity. Then you have the problem of migration. Migration is a fundamental force. All of us, without exception, are migrants out of Africa into wherever we are. And so the world has been populated by migrants. Why do people migrate? Because migration is the search for a better life. That's a human right. It's a human right to try to search for a better life. And so, anybody who's trying to prevent migration through passports or visas or immigration restrictions is violating a fundamental human right. Do you see that contradiction? And it's huge, because none of us is willing to do away with our immigration restrictions, but they are a violation of human rights. And are you doing something about it? Or can you do something about it? And finally, selectivity. We see human rights violations in one place, and we don't see them in other places, even though they are identical. And so, I'm afraid, Mr. Majekodunmi, you have a lot to answer for. And you cannot escape by saying, oh, I'm not a ranking member. You are the only representative sitting here with us, and we are all going to fire our bullets at you and you alone. So defend yourself.
Thank you, Ambassador. Lots of questions. I'll give my best thoughts and responses. Poverty, the most serious affliction in human rights terms of the largest numbers of persons in the world. Very probably the case, and one can cut up poverty into all sorts of different bits in terms of access to healthcare, access to education, access to good housing, access to employment, secondary consequences, and so forth. I would almost turn the question around. I mean, one, I think if one says, well, what are you doing about poverty? I think the issue is not so much human rights as human rights law. I think we're asking, what is the UN doing? Is the UN effectively responding to people's right to development? Is it effectively addressing poverty? I think that there are vast answers there. None of them are very precise. First one that I thought of was, well, is poverty the right entry point from a human rights point of view? Should the right entry point be in fact justice? If every person who was living in abject poverty had access to a judicial process, a fair, independent judicial process, which in turn was sensitive to considering in the course of a judicial process the human rights of that person, be they civil and political or economic, social and cultural rights, then maybe that would be a more effective way to address poverty than for example, some economic programs. I'm skipping around slightly the question of what are you doing about poverty. I'm certainly not a development expert. I think the UN, if we link the issue of poverty and human rights, I think several things. One, the UN is not very good at taking a human rights approach to development or a human rights approach to poverty. It's still quite new. It's amazing. It's been talked about for many, many years, but I think it's still quite new in terms of actual methodologies. I guess I'd say that most of the people who engage in development, the development actors, are not human rights experts. They have other vocabulary, be that economic or education or health, and the human rights vocabulary is not necessarily one which is particularly useful for them. The human rights vocabulary is not always one that's welcome in the forums in which they work, and then there's a discomfort with it. People might sort of say, well, I'm a development actor. I'm working hard for development. Why are you bringing me this sort of collection of laws on access to justice or access to economic, social, and cultural rights? So one, that the UN is not very good at using applying human rights in a development forum, and then secondly, an overlay, the UN is not very good at protecting economic, social, and cultural rights, which by definition are rights that should be realized. In contrast, civil and political rights, the right not to be tortured, you simply have to not torture somebody to respect that right. In contrast to respect the right to healthcare, you have to put in place a healthcare system. South Africa has a very, very good constitution that protects the right to healthcare. A man who was having dialysis treatment was told he would lose his dialysis because he had an incurable case of kidney failure and he would need dialysis for the rest of his life. The hospital only had 20 dialysis machines. They preferred to use them for people who could be cured. He went to court and he lost. The court, rightly or wrongly, made a judgment call on the right to health and looked at it from a collective point of view. So economic, social and cultural rights are not easily justiciable. The UN isn't very good at taking a human rights approach to development, but human rights are useful, I think, in guiding development. I'm going to move swiftly through the questions to allow time for questions at your end. Universality. It's a tough question for the UN. For example, on Human Rights Day, 10th of December last year, here at the UN, we had a first ever. I'm new in New York, but we had a first ever event on the rights of lesbian, gay, and transsexual persons. It was very unusual to have such an event at the UN. There were a lot of member states that attended. It was not an event that was on the formal agenda of member states, certainly not, but it was held in a UN building. The Secretary General came. He was applauded. Some major singers, Ricky Martin, came to promote the event. And the Secretary General himself has begun to talk about these issues. It's often difficult, I think, for Secretary Generals to be on the outer edge of human rights issues, and the Secretary General, I think, is doing that on this issue. But there are many countries that will say, well, there shouldn't be any rights related to LGBT issues. There are cultural issues there are religious issues there. It's a big issue within the US. It's an issue in many other countries. Wearing of the veil, female genital mutilation, the rights of women to drive cars, to be educated in the same places as men, Afghanistan, and so forth. I think my only response is that, number one, there are vastly different cultures within the world, and part of the human rights ethos is to respect cultural diversity. Number two, individuals have rights, which may sometimes clash with cultural practices, and often that's good and in the interest of the individuals who hold those rights. And the individuals who hold those rights, for example, women in Mali, may not want to go through female genital mutilation. Thirdly, rights are enshrined in treaties. A member state has to go, in order for rights to apply in a country, a state has to then become a party to that treaty, unless the rights enshrined in the treaty are also customary law, in which case they're applicable anyway. But customary law only becomes customary law by becoming custom, the custom of many, many, many states. For example, genocide is a part of customary law. So I think the idea that international human rights law is brought and it sort of stamps itself upon and crushes local custom is a false one, I think. And I think on the edges where there may be a slight tension between human rights law and custom, I think those tensions are managed in a fairly good way. Female genital mutilation is gradually being replaced by non-harmful practices which preserve the spirit of the exercise. I'm jumping to the last question. I'm missing out the migration one, but selectivity. The ambassador mentioned the issue of selectivity. I'd perhaps expand on it slightly. How human rights applied, if you like, enforced, imposed on one state versus another. If we look at the Security Council, the Security Council reacts very, very differently with regard to situations in one country versus situations in another. As you all know, the UN is a highly political forum, and decisions, all the major decisions are made by, first and foremost, by governments, and not by the Secretariat of the UN, of which I'm a part. The Secretariat is, in principle, beholden to governments. We implement the instructions of governments. I personally, I think this is a bit of a discussion within the Secretariat. I personally believe the Secretariat has a limited life, spirit, and responsibility of its own. I think that we have a responsibility to we the people, I'm taking the words from the UN Charter, and that we, to a certain extent, we need, for example, to speak truth to power. If human rights violations are occurring, we need to try to respond to that. So I think there are two parts of the UN. There are the political organs of the UN, which will always take political decisions. I think they are gradually moving towards taking decisions which are less selective. I don't think we're going to see an end to selectivity. I think the Secretariat, of which I'm a part, has a role in promoting non-selectivity by ourselves being independent, impartial, and speaking up when human rights violations are occurring wherever they may occur.
Over to you for questions from your end.
Hello, Ambassador Kamal and Mr. Majekodunmi. I think I got that wrong. My name is Adam Jane, and I'm a Chinese and Poli-Sci major here at the University of Pittsburgh. And I wanted to talk about a little about the issue of sovereignty when it comes to human rights. I know that a lot of times when the international community gets involved, it can be seen as a violation of that country's sovereignty when they go in to address these issues. This question's for the both of you. Do you think the international community has a right to violate a country's sovereignty when human rights are at stake, or do you think that it's the duty of the country itself to address these problems?
Take it first.
Thank you very much. I think it's a good question. I'm not an expert on sovereignty, but something that I've certainly thought about in the same context as the question that you asked. And I've come up with questions myself. Say, for example, so what does sovereignty mean? Say, for example, we have a government that's in power, and it's been elected. It's been duly elected through a fair and impartial electoral process, and that government is overthrown by a military coup led by one person and a coterie of military people behind him, perhaps 5,000 soldiers, and they assume power and become the government. If the UN then intervenes, for example, militarily, imposes its will, if you like, on that country, is it invading the country's sovereignty or not? I think sovereignty is a bit of a sliding slope issue depending on the context. But to the heart of your question, if we go back, if we have a duly elected government and it isn't overthrown, but the UN decides to take certain actions, I think that it is totally appropriate. I think it's required of the international community, ideally through the UN. There are other mechanisms to insist on certain minimum standards, most especially with regard to the protection of persons. I think we'd all accept that genocide is unacceptable, or genocide type act, crimes against humanity, where they affect large numbers of people. And I think that the United Nations, post Rwanda notably, not least post the Second World War, has an obligation to act. I think it's very, very, very important to conclude. I think it's very important that whenever the UN intervenes against the will of a state, that it has to do so under very, very, very carefully prescribed rules. The main vehicle for that is through the Security Council, which itself has questions of legitimacy. There are only certain members. The membership was determined a long time ago. It's not regionally representative. So my short answer is that I think, yes, the international community should intervene, and that certain situations trump sovereignty. However, intervention should only be under certain circumstances, well prescribed, and through a suitable mechanism. And I think the mechanism that we have at the moment is a flawed one, which raises questions. It adds a certain grayness to the legitimacy of international intervention.
I personally believe that human rights is a very important principle. It has to be given respect and it has to be implemented. And so the respect for human rights among peoples would allow external intervention. Our problem is that we are in the United Nations system, and the United Nations system is built on the concept of the nation state, which is a member state. And the powers of the nation state are clearly defined in Article 2.7 of the Charter, which says nothing can be done by the United Nations against something which is within the quote-unquote domestic jurisdiction of a member state. That is the definition of sovereignty. And so what the Charter says is that within the four walls of your house, you can literally do anything, and I have no right. But this principle is now slowly being eroded. It is being eroded by what is called responsibility to protect, R2P, which is the right of intervention and the right of oversight over the walls of your house to see what you are doing inside and why your children were shouting that they were being tortured by you. That right of oversight and the right subsequently to intervene is R2P. The problem with R2P is it's a very important principle, and it is going forward also. So sovereignty, which was important, is slowly declining, and intervention, which was weak, is slowly increasing. The problem is that the United States does not accept the responsibility to protect, because responsibility to protect is an automatic principle. Once you agree that it exists, you have to intervene. And the United States position is, I will intervene only where I want to intervene, and I will not intervene where I do not want to intervene. Now that is not compatible with responsibility to protect. And so while the United States talks about responsibility to protect, it is not willing to sign a formal document which says responsibility to protect is an international convention and an international principle. And that, I'm sorry, is a problem of sovereignty. Over to you for a question from your end.
Hi, my name is Naja Martin. I'm a political science major studying international relations here at Pitt. And I have been interested in human trafficking for a very long time. My question to you both is, what initiatives has the UN taken to stop human trafficking? Has it been through education, through punishment, and what have they done recently? Because I know a lot of the policies haven't really worked in the past, simply because of sovereignty and other political issues. But also, what initiatives have you taken to help sovereign countries develop policy better?
Gosh, I'm going to give an absolutely terrible answer. I'm afraid I've never worked on trafficking. I've had colleagues who've worked very much on it, and there was a film recently, a very prominent film that sort of reached Hollywood levels with Rachel Weisz, which was about a friend of mine who works precisely on this issue in Bosnia, but I'm afraid I can't respond. I know there have been efforts moving forward, but I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry.
Let me take it then. Human trafficking is a major problem. It's a major problem because it is a huge growth industry in the world. It's not a marginal industry. It's a growth industry. And you have trafficking of all types. You have trafficking of men as labor. You have trafficking of women as sexual objects. You have the trafficking of children as in very funny situations. For example, there's the trafficking of children into some of the Arab states in the Gulf because they make very good camel riders. And in the Arab states you have races for camels, and they pick up small children and tie them up to the camel as a jockey, and that's how they have races. You also have children being used in what is called bonded labor in brick kilns, because it's a tough job, and you have millions of children, millions in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh who are bonded for brick kilns. So human trafficking has different aspects: men, women, and children. The problem is that each one of these aspects responds to a particular demand. If there is a demand, there is going to be a supply. And there is a demand of men for labor, of women for prostitutes, of children for bonded labor. And the demand is huge and very intense and very highly paid. And so if there is demand, I'm afraid there will be supply. And that is why you have a constant supply of men, a constant supply of women, and a constant supply of children in human trafficking. In fact, if you look at the trends, human trafficking in numbers has increased in the past 10 years. It has not decreased. Despite all the talk of human rights and all the work of Mr. Majekodunmi, it has increased. Why has it increased? Because the demand has increased. And if the demand increases, the supply will increase. This problem is identical to the problem of drugs. The problem of drugs is not a problem of supply. It's a problem of supply and demand. And so there is a pull factor of demand and a push factor of supply. And the same is true of human trafficking. This is one of the very sad parts of our history, that we treat human beings as objects. And I wish I could give you a happier answer, but I can't. Can you give a happier answer?
I can't.
Neither. Okay, over to you for a question from your end.
Good evening, ambassadors. I'm Nick. I'm a politics and philosophy major here at Pitt. So my question is, well, it seems to me that one of the biggest committers of human rights violations seems to be corporations. And of course, they look for the cheapest labor and the cheapest places to place their factories and get production. And of course, these developing countries need their investments. So I'm wondering, what has the Human Rights Council done to prevent these injustices and promote fairer trade and better working conditions for the people in these developing countries?
Thank you. That's a really good question. The UN human rights system, as we've discussed, and as you know, is fundamentally a relationship between people and governments. And where do corporations fit in that? Where does the private sector fit into that? I think sort of over the last 20, 25 years or so, there was growing recognition.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
Thank you. So just picking up, over the last 20, 25 years, there's been growing recognition of the fact that private sector actors, notably corporations, are major violators of human rights. But more importantly, as you suggested, they are violators who are rather impervious to the member states, to the governments of the countries within which they work. So clearly, if one has a human rights system which says to governments, you are the ones responsible for ensuring that rights are protected, but the government isn't actually the most powerful actor in a certain situation of rights violations, then your human rights system is corrupted at best. So I think that recognition it's taken a while to seep in to actual practice, but I think it is seeping in and in numerous ways. Number one, for example, again over the last 20 years or so, there's been an increasing sense that soft law exists. The international law has a soft component, and soft in that there are obligations that are perhaps more easily become customary, even though they haven't been ratified, and soft in that they apply to other actors other than just states. That's private corporations, their responsibilities. In situations of armed conflict, armed opposition groups already bear responsibilities under humanitarian law, but there's a sense that, well, that sets a precedent for a non-governmental actor having responsibilities under international law. So law has perceptions of the applicability and bindingness of the law have moved forward. Secondly, the UN has over time begun to look at actors individually and to speak itself and to address itself directly to corporations. About 10 years ago or so, the UN set up a structure known as the Global Compact. You might know about it, which invited very large corporations to engage in a compact. I think 8 or 9 principles in which they engaged to respect certain practices. So a voluntary kind of compact relationship. Thirdly, the international community, including the UN, has increasingly tried to develop some tools which would make it easier for individual governments, the small government that you refer to, and international bodies to apply pressure on corporations. There is a special rapporteur of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, who is a non-paid expert. He's actually based at the university. I think he's based in Harvard. Actually, there's a new rapporteur. The former rapporteur, John Ruggie, I think is based in Harvard, and he's produced over the last 3 or 4 years a set of guidelines which corporations are strongly advised to respect, and where they don't respect, governments and the UN are strongly advised to try to force corporations to respect. And there's, not in a very systematic way, there have been ad hoc efforts to name private corporations in public UN documents with a view to then providing ammunition for domestic prosecution possibilities, or simply towards damaging their public status. There was a report several years ago on the activities of companies that were engaging in mining in eastern Congo, and a whole swath of human rights violations that were related to those activities. So I think we're far from having any kind of firm solution, but I think that the problem is well recognized, and I think that the recognition of the problem is gradually translating into mechanisms, procedures, and perhaps eventually stronger laws that will allow action to address it.
Over to you for a question from your end. No, can you speak louder, please?
Yes. I would like a 2-part question. First one is, in your opinion, does a country have to be democratic in order to reduce the number of human rights violations? Like, do you consider North Korea like a big human rights violator? And also, by whose standards are human rights defined?
Thank you, Ali. The first question: do you have to be democratic for one to insist upon respect for human rights? It's an interesting question, which one can also kind of play with it a little bit. A few years ago, I remember thinking that arguably a non-democratic country can potentially respect human rights more effectively than some non-democratic countries. To take an extreme, imaginary but not so imaginary example. If one has a country where the rule of law is not firmly respected, where the police or certain parts of the military might commit violations in parts of the country, and because the country isn't sort of firmly controlled from the center, that those agents off in the east or in the north can commit violations with relative impunity. I don't think that a lack of democracy necessarily equates with the worst human rights violations, and a lack of democracy can sometimes facilitate efforts to respect human rights if a government so wishes. However, a lack of democracy also implies that the government in question is not answerable to people, and therefore it isn't necessarily tied into the same incentive system of an obligation to try to respect people's rights. Where there isn't democracy, governments certainly do have human rights obligations. I think one would certainly say that there is grave concern for human rights in North Korea. North Korea has been the subject of a whole range of monitoring systems, but monitoring from a distance because of the very, very poor access. I think that you didn't exactly answer this, but a last part of my answer would be to say that I think in countries where which are not at all democratic, and countries which are very isolated from the norm, if you like, of international political processes, it becomes very, very difficult for an international mechanism to try to promote respect for human rights, because the tools for leverage are simply not there. North Korea, for example, operates in its own orbit. I think the ambassador will know better than I do. And the normal methods of persuasion, the incentives internationally, simply don't play out very well.
I would strongly advise you not to be carried away by the press in its views about North Korea. It just so happens that I have visited North Korea several times. I was the ambassador in South Korea, and where I learnt the Korean language, so I can converse with the Koreans. And North Korea, has many advantages. To begin with, it calls itself a people's democracy. And so you cannot say it is non-democratic, because it has a democracy, and it has some remarkable things. You can eat cheap, you can get an accommodation cheap. All the women in North Korea work in jobs and earn salaries. And so all households have double incomes. These are remarkable. I wish Pakistan could say the same. We can't. We keep our women repressed and depressed. And so I would hold judgment on North Korea for some time. The North Koreans have moved forward and exploded a nuclear weapon yesterday. And everybody says, why did you do it? Well, South Korea has got American troops with nuclear weapons in South Korea. What do you think the North Koreans should do if they have a security problem? So I don't know. I don't know their thinking. I'm not close enough. But I would not judge them too harshly or too fast. Over to you for a question from your end.
My name is Amina, and I was wondering, what actions are the UN taking to deal with the crisis in Mauritania?
In Mauritania?
Yes, West Africa.
What is the crisis in Mauritania?
I'm sorry, neither of us have good answers for you. Our apologies again, not something that I've worked on recently.
Ask me, tell me first, what is the crisis in Mauritania?
Well, in my research, I've read about Mauritania being one of the #1 nations in the world for human rights abuse. They're one of the main countries who still have human slavery as an active part of, I guess, their lifestyles. And
yeah, well, once again, I know Mauritania well. They are very nice people. They're extremely hospitable and extremely poor. It's a tribal country. The whole structure is tribal. And in tribes, you have tribal laws. And so it is quite possible that they have slavery as a tribal custom. You have slavery as a tribal custom in other parts of the world also, in Africa and in the Arab world. And so we are all against slavery because it means a denial of freedom to a person. But some of these people that I've spoken to say, but I'm taking care of this person. I'm giving him food. I'm giving him shelter. I'm even giving him education. And I'm building him up. So who are you to criticize me? But to say that Mauritania is the #1 violator of human rights in the world is wrong. It's just a normal country. And I assure you that they are very friendly and very hospitable as the people. All doors open to you as foreigners in Mauritania. So, whichever text that you have been reading is written by a person who has an angle, and that is dangerous. People with angles who write books. Over to you for a question from your end.
Hello, my name is Roxanne, and I was wondering how the UN goes about promoting human rights without engaging in cultural imperialism.
Go ahead.
Thank you. The UN does promote human rights, and the UN certainly tries not to engage in cultural imperialism. I think one would have to kind of question the question to a certain degree. I mean, I think it's a good question and a challenging one. What would be culturally imperialistic? I'm thinking as I speak. I think that the UN does sometimes try to promote and protect human rights in a way which is actually, I don't know if I'd call it culturally imperialistic, but it's probably not appropriate. I think if I were to give just a very, very physical, very small example, a group of UN staff, I was based in Burundi for a while in 1997, while there was a conflict going on there, and one might have a group of UN staff who are foreigners, not nationals of Burundi, and because of perhaps an unequal relationship of power with a local authority in a small town, UN officials might come and request the local authority to do something, and the local authority perhaps doesn't want to, perhaps thinks that thing is actually not the right thing to do in terms of protecting human rights, but feels unable to push back. Ideally, the UN officials who are making the request should ensure that their request is made in such a way that it's fully respectful of the authority, that she feels completely able to say, well, no, actually, that's not the right thing to do. But that doesn't always happen. I think sometimes we might not have that sensitivity. We might arrive in a way which doesn't fully understand the context in which we're making certain claims. So I think my first answer would be that we don't always respect local authorities, and that might ultimately end in a sort of an imposed solution, which one could call cultural imperialism in the extreme. I think the UN sort of over an entire country or globally doesn't do that. How do we not? I think number one, as we discussed already, I think the human rights that we promote are rights which emerge through years and years and years of discussions between member states, and then they're ratified or they become customary law through practice. So I think in the essence of the subject that we're talking about is something which is not cultural imperialism in of itself. It's something which has a good deal of support from a wide range of governments. Number two, when the UN engages in its activities, there's usually, not always, but usually a great deal of consultation before doing a certain thing. You might consult with the authorities in the country in which you're going to work. We would ideally consult with members of civil society to make sure that other constituents within the country who might not be represented by the particular government in power, but might, for example, represent person from a particular part of the country, from a regional group, from an ethnic group, from a religious group. Lots of civil society consultation at the international level here in New York, ideally at a local level on the ground, and whatever comes out of that, whatever emerges in terms of an action to promote, for example, a campaign over 1 year to promote the rights of women to be protected from violence, whatever the promotional action is, ideally it's already got a great deal of consensus and it's been checked with a good number of actors who understand the context in which it's being applied and have said, this isn't the right way to do it, this is a better way, and ideally we would have taken that on board.
Over to you for a question. I think we have time for a couple of questions.
Hello, yes, my name is Matt. We have come across in our readings a problem with consent, and So my question for you is it still a human rights violation if somebody consents to have their rights to give them up, if they willingly put themselves in there?
Gosh, that's a very good question. I think the only way that I would know to approach that would be through the law. I suspect there's a whole body of philosophy on the issue which I'm not really very familiar with, and the law itself is not very clear. It shifts from country to country, and to be honest, I don't know to what extent that the UN itself has addressed the issue. In domestic law, for example, depending on the country, it can be illegal to have assisted suicide. In Holland, it's not illegal. In other countries, it's under debate. So on that most fundamental issue of the right to life, it's an issue on which certainly governments, member states, are not comfortable, and I think populations are also not that comfortable. I think that to the extent I'm trying to think of context in which I might have approached this. I worked in Nepal for many years, and when I was there was an armed conflict in which an opposition armed group, Maoists, was fighting against the government, and the Maoists were committing a whole range of human rights violations, but unusual in my experience in armed groups, they had a very, very strong philosophy of why they were fighting, and their fighting, they would say, is because there is great inequality in this country, because if you come from a lower caste, you will not have the same opportunities in your life, you will not have the same health, you will not have the same access to education if you come from a certain part of the country. And the Maoists would do things like they would go to a school and they would leave a message with the principal saying, if you do not, either you stop charging fees in the school in 2 days' time, or else we will come back and kill all of the teachers. That was the extent of their philosophy. So in terms of issues of consent in that context, if somebody had said to us, the UN human rights actors, that, well, we are lower caste people, the Maoists are fighting for us, and that person were to say, well, I don't want them to fight for me, I'm quite fine living in my conditions without access to education and so forth, and only doing certain menial jobs. If one were to apply the issue of consent to that particular dynamic, what would I say? I suspect that as an organisation, we wouldn't respond positively to that kind of an appeal. I think we would assume perhaps this would be cultural imperialism. I think we would assume that that person was not expressing consent in an informed manner. The person's very situation of vulnerability would mean that the person was not in a position to be able to say, well, actually, I do want to have access to education and healthcare. So I'm thinking about this while I answer. I suspect that we, as an organisation, probably wouldn't be too sensitive to the issue of consent, because we would assume that that the very issue could not be broached with a person whose human rights were so vulnerable that they weren't free to express the consent.
Over to you for a question from your end.
Hello, my name is Shilpa. I know that a lot of human rights abuses are done by the social structures that are meant to protect people, like the police department, for example. Is corruption such as this something the Human Rights Council is working on, or is it just seen as something within the country's jurisdiction?
That's a good question. I didn't hear the example that you gave.
Well, my question is, corruptions like the police department, is it something...
Okay. Yeah, thanks. It's a very good question. I think corruption is a vast problem. Corruption of different types. I mean, financial most obviously, but linked in with political corruption. I travelled to Sri Lanka in 2007 and met with government officials and met with police officers, and some police officers told me that, well, frankly, it's very, very difficult for us to address human rights abuses because of an environment that, for me as a police officer, does not allow me to do my work. There's an environment within the police has become politicized. Some police officers really want to do a good job, but others don't. And the weight of the weight is more in favour of those who don't want to do the right thing. So one, I think that corruption, I'd expand it slightly. I think corruption comes in different forms with different incentive processes. Number two, getting closer to your question, I think that we don't really tackle corruption directly, at least not in a human rights framework. I think there may well be other UN actors that do. I'm not directly familiar with them, perhaps the UN Development Programme. From a human rights point of view, what we would do in a situation like that is go to the law. We would sort of say, well, why is it that the law is allowing corruption to happen? Or more specifically, we see corruption because this was a judicial process regarding somebody who was complaining about the fact that he was tortured yesterday by police officers, and there's been no investigation by the police because they're involved. There's been no fair decision by the judge because he's been corrupted. And so our response to that situation of corruption would be to say, well, why isn't the law being applied? And then we would want to look at, well, why is the investigative body that should be making sure that police respect the law? Where is the judicial body which should be guaranteeing the conduct of the judiciary, or which should be protecting the judiciary from independence? So I think we address the consequences of the problem through a different angle, but we don't necessarily address the core problem itself, which I think is partly because of the way the UN is set up, or partly because of the machinery of the human rights tools that we have.
Over to you. I leave it to you to decide whether we are out of time or whether we have time for one more question.
We're actually out of time now. So I would like to thank you, Ambassador Kamal and Mr. Majekodunmi. Sorry if I said it wrong. Thank you for sharing your insight on human rights.
We will meet again on the 28th on the subject of international migration, and my guest will be the head of the International Organization for Migration. The head of the United Nations Refugee Relief and Welfare Organization, the person who is in charge of Gaza and who is an expert on internal displacement and migration. And so, if some of you have questions about Gaza, that is the person to prepare them for. And in the meantime, I'd like to thank Mr. Majekodunmi for taking time out to take these slings and arrows that I have been launching at him in such good spirit. Thank you.